The storm came in sideways, not like a polite rain, but like the sky had grown angry and meant to scrub the valley clean of names. At the edge of town, where the sage thinned and the ground turned to hardpan and gravel, a figure moved with the careful steadiness of someone who had learned to read danger the way other people read weather. The Apache woman, Delphine Tomei, kept low beneath her hood, her shawl pulled tight, her blanket roll slung close to her ribs. Each time lightning tore open the clouds, she looked not upward but outward, scanning the scrub for motion, for riders, for the telltale glint of a gun barrel. She had ridden hard for 2 days. The horse's sides were lathered, the reins stiff with old sweat, and the animal's ears kept flicking as if it could hear something that Delphine could not. The trail into town was not a trail anyone marked on a map. It was a seam of familiarity stitched through rough country. Old buffalo routes and game paths, the kind of directions you learned from people who never sat still long enough to forget. She had taken it anyway, because staying out beyond the last ranches meant freezing in the open. Coming to town meant finding a roof, and finding a roof meant finding witnesses. Her hunger did not feel like a simple emptiness. It felt like betrayal, like something in her body had begun to argue that survival was not worth whatever cost it demanded. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago, but she kept them busy, tightening a strap, checking the angle of a hidden pouch, pressing her palm against her own ribs where her heart beat too fast for her liking. The pouch held a folded document wrapped in oiled cloth, a thing she had carried like a sin and a promise both. It was not a love letter. It was not a talisman. It was worse than either. The feud had been going on so long the town treated it like a weather pattern. 2 families, 2 lines of men who had taken turns protecting their pride and punishing anyone who stepped into the wrong patch of land. Elders spoke of it in saloon conversations with lowered voices, as if admitting how much blood had soaked into the soil was a kind of blasphemy. Delphine had heard those stories since she was old enough to sit near campfire smoke and listen between the words. She had watched the feud chew through people who looked like cousins, like neighbors, like strangers who were only alive by accident. She had also watched the feud change shape as the years passed. What began as raiding turned into tit-for-tat killings. What turned into killings turned into laws written with pen and ink, and laws turned into threats that traveled faster than bullets. Tonight, the threat had finally caught her. A half-mile behind her, or maybe a mile, she could feel them in the way the air tightened. Boots in wet ground, hooves that hesitated before committing to the same slick patches. She did not see them until the storm parted for a heartbeat, and in that brief opening she caught the silhouette of riders on a ridgeline. She had a choice, but it was not a clean one. Go deeper into the hills and hope the next day's daylight hit her well enough to slip away, or ride straight into the one place in town that truly mattered, the saloon. The saloon served as the town's meeting hall, its courthouse, its chapel for sinners, its stage for gossip. In a frontier place where folks had no patience for distance, trouble learned to gather under a single roof. If she meant to avoid being picked off on the trail, she needed the thick walls and the crowd. Not because crowds made people kind, but because crowds made people hesitate. She guided her horse toward the lights. The town gathered around the saloon like smoke around a pipe, messy, unavoidable. Lanterns burned low in the wind, their flames strained and shivering. The muddy street glistened, reflecting the gold glow of whiskey bottles behind glass. When Delphine crossed the threshold, the heat hit her like a slap. Damp wool and wet leather crowded the air. The smell of frying fat from the cook stove tangled with tobacco and wet wool. The saloon's owner moved with practiced control behind the bar. Rosalind Hawthorne kept her chin slightly raised, her eyes quick, her hands steady. She had the kind of calm that came from surviving men who mistook volume for authority. She did not smile right away. She watched. Delphine dismounted where the floorboards near the door always held the worst puddles. Her horse shied, sensing the strange mix of damp and spirits. Delphine steadied it with a whispered word and a firm hand, though her mouth was so dry it barely made sound. The men turned their faces as a single organism. Not out of kindness, out of curiosity sharpened by caution. A new woman in the saloon during a storm meant either trouble had come home or trouble had decided to make a stop. Delphine pulled her hood back just enough for them to see the dark braid at her temple and the beadwork at her shawl. The look in the room changed immediately. Some faces tightened, some widened with hungry interest. A man in a soiled vest muttered something about savages, and another answered with a laugh that did not rise to his eyes. Delphine's stomach knotted. She knew what they expected to happen next. She expected to be named a target, to be pushed out into the storm, to be treated as if cold was a sentence she had earned. She expected someone to decide she was already guilty because her people had once been blamed for every missing horse and every stolen child. Then the cowboy appeared, not like a hero from a story, but like a man who had learned how to keep moving through disasters. Elias Mercer stood near the edge of the room where shadows pooled, hat damp with rain, coat hung heavy on his shoulders. He had the kind of stance that said he could fight, but preferred not to. His eyes moved over the room first, then paused on Delphine with a stillness that felt like a locked door. He did not grin. He did not call out. He simply stepped forward as if the question had already been answered. The bartender, Rosalind, glanced once at Elias and then back to Delphine. In the flickering light, Elias looked older than the men around him, older by the number of winters he'd survived. His hands carried the quiet confidence of work done repeatedly, fixing broken harnesses, mending fences, hauling water when the wind stole the strength from your fingers. "You're soaked," Elias said, voice low enough to be heard without announcing itself. "You'll catch your death in a place like this without a fire close by." Delphine did not trust easy words. She had seen kindness used like a trap. She kept her gaze steady, but her shoulders eased half an inch, the way a person might unclench a fist they didn't know they had. "I can pay for a blanket," she said. Her voice had a careful rasp to it, shaped by the cold and the miles. Elias's eyes flicked to the pouch at her belt, then away. That was another kind of respect, one Delphine had learned was rare. "You can pay," Elias agreed, "but not like they mean to take it." Around them, men shifted. The mention of taking payment had the effect of focusing attention. It made everyone remember they had money and grudges and the power to decide how the night ended. The storm outside roared, and with it came the sound of hoofbeats hardening on the wet street. The door swung open hard enough to throw wind into the saloon, and cold air flooded the room with the smell of rain and churned mud. Two riders entered, faces shadowed by their hats. Their boots carried water, and their hands rode close to the grips of their guns. Delphine felt the room tilt, not physically, emotionally. The way men looked at her changed from curious to certain, like they had finally found the page they wanted in a book. Elias moved half a step closer, never turning his back to the door. His calm did not become loud. It became heavier. Rosalind, from behind the bar, set a mug down with a deliberate click. "This house sells liquor, not blood," she said. Her tone was firm, but it did not ask permission. It announced boundaries the town pretended to respect. One of the riders, broad-shouldered, rain-dark coat, eyes that searched for excuses, spoke with the confidence of a man who had already decided. "She's trespassing. Her people crossed lines folks drew with their own hands." Delphine swallowed. Her lips tasted of metal. She wanted to speak, but she also knew speech could be used as proof against her. She reached for the strap of her shawl with one hand, not as a defense, but to steady herself. Elias looked at the rider, then at the other. "You're not taking her out in this weather," he said. The first rider laughed. It came out sharp and offended. "And who are you to stop us? This ain't your range." Elias's gaze stayed flat. "It's my conscience," he said, and the room went quiet in the way it does when someone says a truth that makes cowards uncomfortable. Delphine watched him, trying to understand what kind of man could speak about conscience in a saloon that ran on vice. She had expected a cowboy's help to look like bravery for show. Elias's help looked like something else, like a decision he had already made before he ever walked into the room. Rosalind leaned slightly forward. "If there's a claim," she said, "you make it in daylight." The rider's eyes narrowed. "Daylight won't change what she owes." Delphine's heartbeat thudded. Owes. That word was a blade. She had heard it in other contexts. Promises extracted. Debts turned into excuses to settle scores. Her people had been forced into barter before, forced into surrender disguised as trade. Elias reached into his coat slowly, not for a gun, but for something else. A folded paper, creased from handling, edges worn. The men recognized official paperwork even in the rain. A piece of paper carried authority when people believed ink could replace mercy. Elias held it where the lantern light could catch it. "She's under my protection tonight," he said. The rider scoffed. "Under your protection? You don't got that kind of standing." Elias's mouth tightened. "No," he said, and Delphine heard the weight behind the single syllable. "But I got enough standing to keep a body from turning cold on my floor." Rosalind's eyes stayed on Delphine. She seemed to weigh something inside herself. Not just law, and not just gossip, but the kind of judgment a woman made when she had watched men ruin themselves and women disappear into the dark. Elias kept his position like a wall. Delphine recognized that stillness as a skill, not an accident. Then the second rider reached into his coat and drew out a small book, leather-bound, with a list of names. "We know where you've been," he said, voice dripping with certainty. "We know what your family took, and we know what she's carrying." Delphine's fingers went numb again around her strap. The pouch at her belt felt suddenly heavier than before. A rumor, Elias's paper, the rider's book. It all pointed toward one possibility, the one Delphine had tried not to think about. Someone had followed her. Someone had known she would try to reach town. Someone had decided the feud was not finished with her yet. And worse, someone had decided the feud's next generation would be the weapon. The riders leaned in. They spoke of land, of debts, of a wrong done years ago when Delphine's mother had been forced into a bargain meant to end a conflict. One conflict that never ended but simply changed who held the knife. Delphine stood her ground anyway. She had endured far more than a night in a saloon. The storm had already stripped her down to essentials: survive, escape, keep the pouch safe, and keep her promise to the future. Elias's voice cut through the rider's talk. "You want her? Wait until the marshal's got his boots on the ground. Wait until the ground's firm enough to bury your pride in." The riders hesitated. Men like them often wanted violence instantly, because violence in the dark felt like proof they were powerful. But they also feared consequences they could not control. The papers, the crowded room, the owner's defiance, all of it pulled at their certainty. The first rider spat into the mud outside and shifted his weight. "This town's full of folks who forget what side they're on," he said. "Then remember," Elias replied, "you're standing on my line. And tonight, you cross it without getting my boots kicked through your teeth." The threat was plain enough to understand without extra words. The room stirred. A few men looked away as if pretending the argument belonged to someone else. Others watched with the hungry intensity of spectators at a hangman's rope. Rosalind cleared her throat. "The Duke ain't here," she called, voice rising just enough to carry over the murmurs. "But I'll tell you this. If you drag her out, you'll be doing it in front of everyone who heard you." The second rider's jaw flexed. His eyes flicked to the crowd, measuring the number of witnesses. He didn't want witnesses. He wanted a private ending. He also didn't want to look weak in a room full of men trained to confuse bravery with aggression. So they retreated, but not kindly. They left a threat behind like spilled whiskey. "This ain't finished." The door shut, and the wind's roar reduced to the softer hiss of rain against wood. Delphine exhaled slowly. Her knees threatened to soften. Elias caught her just with his eyes, not his hands. That restraint mattered. It told her he wouldn't touch her without permission, even when the room was full of people who believed touch was ownership. Rosalind moved to the stove and fed it kindling, coaxing a flame into warmth. She did not offer Delphine pity. She offered practical help. "Blanket on the couch," she said, "and you'll drink something hot, not whiskey. Tea, if you'll accept it." Delphine nodded once. She stood on her own, but her breath shuddered. Elias stayed by the door, listening to the night the way a man listens to a gun that might be cocked again. His eyes did not leave Delphine for long, not because he wanted her as a conquest, because he wanted to make sure she survived the next hour. "You can't keep them off forever," Delphine murmured when the worst of the storm's noise softened. Elias's reply came after a pause, as if he chose each word carefully. "No," he said, "but I can keep them from pretending they're righteous." The phrase struck Delphine like a truth she had been circling for days. Righteousness. People always called their cruelty virtue when it suited them. In the quiet that followed, Delphine unwrapped a small corner of her pouch enough to show Elias the edge of the paper inside. Not the whole document, she still needed distance, but she offered proof of what she carried. Elias leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing. He saw the marks, the seal partially hidden under oilcloth. His face changed, not into a smile, not into outrage, but into something more complicated. Grief, mixed with anger, mixed with fear. "That's the deed," he said quietly. Delphine's throat tightened. "It's a claim," she corrected, voice steadying. "It's an inheritance my people paid for with blood. They kept it locked up, like the land itself would learn to forgive if nobody spoke the truth." Elias looked at her, and in that look Delphine saw the twist she hadn't wanted. The feud wasn't only a fight over territory, it was a fight over who got to decide what history counted. Rosalind poured tea into a mug and set it down in front of Delphine without touching her. Delphine took it carefully. The heat seeped into her hands, then into her ribs. Elias remained standing, as if sitting would tempt the room's trouble to settle. "Your next move is to get inside daylight," he said. Delphine lifted her eyes. "Daylight won't protect me," she said. "They'll bring someone with a badge." Elias's jaw tightened. "They might," he admitted, "but the marshal's not the first man to wear the law like a coat. I know how this town bends rules. I also know what happens when people realize the old generation's promises don't belong to them anymore." Delphine stared into her tea, watching the surface ripple. Her mind ran through the document in her pouch. She had carried it because it was the only leverage she had left. It declared ownership of land in her family's name, land they had lost, reclaimed, lost again, then hidden under the kind of paperwork that let bullies call theft settlement. Delphine had promised her mother she would use the deed before the last year of her mother's life ended. The time had come, and the storm had pushed her into town at the worst possible hour. Outside, thunder rolled again. The storm had settled into the walls like a living thing. Rain tapped the windows, steady and patient. Rosalind spoke with a softer voice now, as if the room's heat had made her braver. "You're not from around here," she said. Delphine nodded. "I was taken," she replied, and even though she spoke gently, the words carried the weight of a confession. "And then I was returned. The promise was supposed to be peace. It became a leash." Rosalind's eyes narrowed. "Families here don't understand peace," she said. "They understand winning." Elias exhaled. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with riding. "And the next generation's about to win," he said. Delphine looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Elias hesitated, then spoke like a man choosing truth over comfort. "It's not the old men after you," he said. "It's their sons and grandsons. The feud's been passed down like a rifle. But they don't want the old way. They want a newer way, one that makes them look respectable." Delphine felt a chill deeper than the storm. Respectable violence. That was always the most dangerous kind. She held her mug, then set it down slowly. "Then why help me?" she asked Elias. The question came from a place of fear, not accusation. She wanted to know if she had stepped into a trap dressed as kindness. Elias looked away toward the window, where lightning flashed and showed the rain like curtains. "Because I've seen what happens when the town decides who deserves to live," he said. "And because I'm tired of men who call themselves honorable while they gut people." Rosalind watched them, her expression unreadable. Elias's words sounded like the kind of sentiment that got spoken once, then acted upon. Delphine wondered what Elias had done in his life that made him speak that way. The room's quiet did not last. Outside, voices rose briefly, muffled by rain. Then came a sound like a wagon settling into mud, and the low clank of a harness as someone dismounted. Elias moved to the door without a word. Delphine followed him with her eyes. A young man entered first, dripping wet, shoulders squared too carefully. Behind him came another youth, eyes bright with something that could be either courage or cruelty. They wore the kind of neatness that suggested their families wanted the town to see them as different from the old killers. Delphine recognized them without being told. She had seen them at a distance during her rides, the way you recognize a knife even if you've never held it. The first, slim, controlled, spoke as if he owned the room. "Miss," he said. He didn't use woman or Apache Woman with respect. He used the word like he was measuring her for a coffin. "We have legal business with you." The second stepped forward and held out a paper. "This deed was claimed by my family years ago," he said. "We've kept the line. We're not letting it pass to outsiders." Delphine felt her pulse spike. "Outsider?" she repeated, and the words scraped her throat. "My mother bled for this valley, and I was born into it by story and by hunger. You don't get to call me outsider because your hands wear clean gloves." The young men looked at each other, then at Elias. Elias didn't move. He stood between them and Delphine like the doorway of a church. "You'll wait," he said. The slim one laughed without warmth. "Wait? She's got no claim now, not once the marshal hears it in the proper order." Delphine's eyes narrowed. "Proper order," she echoed. Rosalind's voice cut in. "You mean the order that makes you sound innocent," she said. The youth's smile faltered. He recovered quickly. "This is a matter of settlement. Your saloon shouldn't interfere." Delphine watched his hands. They were steady. That steadiness worried her. Men who expected to win rarely show fear. Elias reached out for Delphine's deed, slowly, asking without touching. Delphine pulled it free from her pouch and held it out to him. Elias took it, unfolded it fully under the lamplight, and studied the seal. His face tightened again. "Where did you get this?" the second young man asked sharply. Delphine swallowed. "From my people," she said. Elias's voice changed, becoming careful. "No," he said quietly. "This seal's not from your people's archive." He looked at Delphine, and in his eyes she saw the betrayal coming before it arrived. "This seal is from the Hawthorne Ledger." The room stilled. Rosalind's breath caught. Her hand tightened on the edge of the bar. Delphine turned to her slowly. "You knew," Delphine said. Rosalind's face showed a flicker, something like regret or fear. Then she straightened. "I knew a rumor," she said. "I didn't know what they'd make of it." The slim youth stepped forward. "Rosalind," he said, voice hardening, "don't start lying now." Delphine felt sick. The feud families, the feud generations. The next generation refusing to continue the old bloodshed, so they'd found a cleaner way. But the deed's seal in her hands meant a different twist, a more vicious one. The saloon owner, the woman who had offered warmth and tea, had been part of the paper trail all along. Or she had tried to stop it and failed. Elias held the deed up again. "This deed was never meant to return to Delphine," he said. "It was meant to be used." Delphine stared at the document as if it could explain itself. The ink wasn't simply old, it was moved. The oilcloth wrap had been handled. Someone had repacked it with intention. Her mind raced back to the moment she left camp, to the whispered warning she had received from an elder whose voice shook, a warning about the saloon's owner, about someone who had always seemed kind but whose kindness had a price. Delphine had believed she was being lied to because she wanted to believe. She had wanted safety more than accuracy. Now she understood she wasn't being lied to in the way enemies lie. She was being guided. A quiet, terrible realization settled. She had been brought here because the deed would make sense to the people who knew where it belonged. The young men moved toward her, and the room's warmth turned sharp. Elias's hand drifted toward the pocket where his revolver lived. He didn't draw yet. He didn't want violence inside Rosalind's saloon, not when so many men could claim later that the first shot came from the wrong direction. Rosalind spoke fast, voice trembling just enough to show it was real. "You don't understand what you've started," she said to the young men. "You think paper's clean. Paper's just a different kind of blood." The slim youth's eyes were cold. "Paper is proof," he said, "and proof is what wins." Delphine realized the next generation's subversion of the feud. They would not shoot her in the street like their grandfathers did. They would outmaneuver her in daylight, ruin her name with ink, and let the town congratulate itself for being civilized. Elias leaned closer to Delphine. His voice dropped so only she could hear. "They plan to drag you into a hearing," he murmured. "And once you're branded as having no lawful claim, they'll make you leave. Or worse." Delphine's hands shook around her tea mug. She wanted to hide the deed again, to swallow it like a confession. But the pouch was empty of certainty. She had only one thing left: control of what the room knew. She looked at Rosalind first. "You can still stop it," Delphine said. Rosalind's eyes shone with unshed tears. She didn't look away. "I can try," she said. Delphine turned to Elias and made her decision quickly. "Then try with me." She raised her chin toward the crowd. Her voice carried not because she shouted, but because she had learned to speak so people listened instead of waited for permission. "You want lawful proof?" Delphine said. "Then read the part you don't want read." Elias placed the deed back in Delphine's hands. The young men stepped forward, expecting her to crumble. Instead, she unwrapped the oilcloth and pointed to a line of writing so faint it almost vanished under age. "This page was written in my mother's hand," she said. "Not in the ledgers, not in Hawthorne ink. In the language she was forced to stop using. You can't read it, can you? So you think it doesn't exist?" The room murmured. Some men leaned in, others scoffed. But Delphine had already seen what she needed: attention. Rosalind moved behind the bar and reached under a drawer. She brought out a thin notebook and opened it with hands that looked steadier than her face. "I can read it," she said, voice low. Delphine's heart lurched. "You—" Rosalind swallowed. "I learned because she taught me in secret," she said. "Not because I wanted to steal your inheritance, because I wanted the feud to end with a truth no one could bury." The slim youth's face flushed with anger. "Rosalind, stop!" Elias stepped between them again, using his body like a barrier. "She's telling the truth," he said, "whether it makes you uncomfortable or not." Rosalind turned a page in the notebook. She read aloud a translation of the faint writing on the deed, names, dates, and a promise made under a sky that looked like this one. The promise was not about giving land. It was about protection. Delphine listened, and with every word her fear shifted into a sharper, more complicated emotion: understanding. Her mother had not only been forced into bargains, she had also planted records. She had created a way to reclaim truth when the right generation arrived, when someone would refuse to continue the feud. The twist lay under the plot the young men thought they controlled. The next generation had been taught that violence was the only way to settle old wrongs. But Delphine's deed wasn't for violence. It was for undoing the feud without blood. The young men didn't want peace. They wanted to keep their family's power while appearing clean. Rosalind's notebook revealed something else, too. The deed's seal had been moved because someone had tried to keep Delphine from using it. But Rosalind had also hidden it again, refusing to let the young men finalize their plan. The first rider's earlier threats returned in Delphine's memory: the proper order. It had been a trap set in a saloon, executed with courtroom theatrics. Delphine turned toward Elias with a gaze that asked him to trust her. Elias did not ask questions now. He waited. Delphine spoke again, addressing the room at large. "If the deed is real, then I'll register it at the courthouse at dawn. Not later. Not after the marshal hears it. Now." The slim youth spat a word. "You can't," he snapped. Delphine didn't flinch. "I can," she said, "because Rosalind already read what you didn't. Because Elias Mercer already saw the seal, and because you can't claim ignorance when the whole town heard the truth." Rosalind looked to Elias, then back to Delphine. She seemed surprised by her own courage. Elias nodded once. "I'll ride with you," he said. Delphine's breath caught. Not because she needed a protector now in the way the earlier riders threatened her. She needed protection in a different way. Protection from the town's opinion, from men who would rather make her a villain than admit their families were wrong. "I can't ask you," Delphine began. Elias's voice softened. "You can ask me," he said. "I'm not asking, I'm saying." A storm-torn silence filled the saloon. Then the marshal's horse outside clopped into the street, delayed by rain. A distant shout carried, someone calling for the marshal to come in and settle it. Men's voices rose, eager to turn the night into spectacle. But Rosalind moved first. She locked the door, not with an iron shackle meant to imprison anyone, with a simple latch that told the world the saloon had a boundary. "You'll do it in my town with my rules," she said. The young men surged forward, grabbing at papers and at pride. Elias caught a wrist, quick, controlled. Not a punch, not a slap, just enough to halt motion. He held the young man at arm's length as if reminding him that strength didn't have to be loud to be absolute. Delphine stepped around them, moving to the doorway where rain streaked the glass. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked at the crowd, at the men whose eyes wanted drama, at the women whose faces held silence. She could feel the old feud's gravity tugging at the room. She also felt something else tugging back. A chance. Not romantic as in songs, romantic as in choices that changed what a person became. Elias joined her at the door. His presence was a warmth not measured by firelight. "You still think the feud ends with blood?" he asked quietly. Delphine shook her head, and her voice, when it came, was barely above the rain's hiss. "No," she said. "I think it ends with refusing to hide." They waited until the marshal entered, until his hat dripped rain and his face carried that tired authority that came from knowing most disputes were only arguments with guns waiting nearby. Delphine stood before him holding the deed and the notebook translation from Rosalind's ledger. She spoke without begging. She spoke like the rightful owner of a future. The marshal read the papers. He read them slowly because he recognized that mistakes could turn into bodies. Men in the room murmured. Some looked at Elias with resentment, as if kindness were a crime. Some looked at Delphine with suspicion, as if truth could be an insult to their worldview. But as the marshal's eyes moved line by line, his expression shifted into reluctant seriousness. "This deed is valid," he said finally. His voice carried the strain of admitting the law could be a shield for someone the town disliked. "And the ledger statement verifies the claim." The young men paled. The feud they had hoped to continue, only cleaner, only more respectable, collapsed under the weight of evidence they had not expected to be brought into the open. They tried to argue. They tried to raise the same threats as the earlier riders. Trespass, trespass, trespass. But the marshal's patience snapped like a rope. "Dawn hearing," he declared, "and if anyone attempts to interfere before then, they'll answer to me." Delphine felt her knees go weak with relief, and then harden again with responsibility. Relief was dangerous. It made people stop moving. Elias offered Delphine his arm as she turned away from the marshal, not as an ownership claim, but as a steadying hand for travel. Delphine hesitated just long enough to make sure her permission was clear, then took it. Rosalind stood behind the bar, her face pale. She watched Delphine and Elias like a woman watching a door finally swing open after years of being trapped on one side. Delphine approached Rosalind and spoke softly. "You risked everything," she said. Rosalind's eyes shimmered. "I risked being hated," she replied. "It's easier than risking being wrong." Delphine's throat tightened. "Why?" Rosalind looked toward the rain, toward the dark road that led to tomorrow. "Because I learned once what your mother taught me," she said, "that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the refusal to repeat harm." Elias listened, silent. Then, As if the storm had been waiting for permission, the clouds began to thin. Dawn was not gentle yet. There were still streaks of dark overhead, but the rain softened into a gray mist. In the frontier, mist meant survival. It meant tracks visible enough to follow and roads passable enough to choose. Delphine stepped back, gathering her blanket roll. "We leave now," she said. Elias nodded. "We leave," he echoed. The saloon behind them buzzed with argument. Some men swore their families would fight this in court. Some swore the marshal was compromised. Some swore Delphine was a witch of paperwork. But Delphine didn't hear all of it. She heard only the sound of hoofbeats readying. She heard Elias's breathing under his hat. She heard Rosalind's quiet call before they stepped outside. "Wait," Rosalind said. Delphine turned. Rosalind held out a small cloth pouch, similar to Delphine's but lighter. "I kept the other half," she said. "The letter your mother never got to mail. It's not about land, it's about why she did it." Delphine's eyes widened. "You kept it?" Rosalind nodded. "Because I thought someday someone would deserve the whole truth," she replied. "I just didn't know it would be you." Delphine took the pouch carefully, as if it weighed more than paper. It did. It carried the missing reason behind the deed's existence. Elias helped Delphine mount her horse, his movements careful around her body and her balance. When she settled in the saddle, the morning light, thin as hope, caught the beadwork on her shawl and turned it briefly into something like gold. They rode out as the town woke, arguing itself into new angles of anger. Behind them, the saloon's lanterns continued burning, stubborn against the day. On the road toward the courthouse, the ground slowly shifted from mud to firmer earth. The storm receded, leaving the sky washed and wide. Delphine looked at Elias once, her expression controlled but her eyes bright with something she tried not to name. She had been hunted. She had been used. She had been rescued, not always by bullets but by choices. Elias's kindness had not fixed everything. It had only kept her alive long enough for truth to do its work. Elias spoke then, quiet between the hooves' steady rhythm. "You don't owe me a thing," he said. Delphine's mouth curved faintly. "I know," she replied. "And yet," Elias continued, and the word hung between them like a rope lowered from a cliff. "When I told the riders they couldn't drag you out, it wasn't paper. It wasn't law. It was you as a person." Delphine turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. She didn't pretend she was unafraid. She didn't pretend the world was safe. But she let herself believe in one more dangerous possibility, that in a country built on broken promises, a new promise could be made. When they reached the courthouse, the line of people had already formed. Men with hats and women with shawls waited as if the law were a show. Delphine dismounted and stepped forward with the pouch Rosalind had given her. Elias walked beside her. Under a cold sky beginning to clear, the marshal announced the hearing would proceed immediately. The young men tried once more to argue, but their certainty had fractured. The crowd's mood had shifted. Whispers traveled faster than threats. Delphine spoke again, this time with the letter's words. Her mother's voice, written in hidden script and translated, explained that she had planted the deed to end the feud by forcing truth into open daylight. The feud's next generation had been expected to refuse old violence, but instead they had tried to steal peace and call it settlement. The courtroom's air changed as people realized the subversion had been theirs, not Delphine's. When the marshal ruled, he ruled in Delphine's favor, not as charity, as recognition. The old feud did not vanish overnight. Frontier communities didn't stop being dangerous because someone made a correct decision. Still, something shifted. Elias watched the young men's shoulders sag as if the wind had been taken from their sails. He saw men in the crowd glance at one another with embarrassment instead of hunger. Delphine received the deed's return not like a prize, but like a responsibility. And when she finally turned back toward Elias, her eyes softened with gratitude that wasn't desperate and love that wasn't loud. Elias offered his hand. "Walk with me," he said. Not toward a bedroll in the night, not toward a saloon where trouble pooled, but toward the small tasks that made life real, repairing a fence, building a place that held warmth without asking anyone to bleed for it. Delphine took his hand. It wasn't the kind of romance that arrived with certainty and fireworks. It was the kind that came with storms past, with truth carried through mud, with paper and courage and a refusal to repeat harm. The frontier kept turning. The wind kept testing roofs. But Delphine's future shifted into place because Elias stayed when others rode past, and because the Apache woman didn't let the town rewrite her story. In the quiet after the hearing, as the sky cleared and sunlight touched the wet stones, Delphine and Elias walked out together, slow and steady, toward a home they would make carefully, where the feud's silence would finally break, and love could exist without pretending it hadn't cost anything.